In the last few episodes of Season 2 of the Chosen series, we saw a plot begin to form against Jesus. This plot is spearheaded by Shimai of Capernaum, and it's aimed at neutralizing Jesus' growing influence among the people and executing him as a false prophet. In Season 2, the plot involves two schools of thought among the Pharisees of the first century. The accusers of Jesus first approached the followers of the famous Rabbi Hillel in Episode 7, and they're brushed aside as time wasters who are bringing a petty lawsuit. But in Episode 8 of Season 2, the accusers decide to abandon attempts to persuade the Hillel party and instead bring their accusations to the rival group of the Pharisees known to follow Rabbi Shammai. Shammai agrees to hear their case and is delighted to help, not so much because he's worried that Jesus is a significant threat, but because it will make his rivals, the followers of Hillel, look bad. So what's this all about? To get a running start, we need a quick review of what the Pharisees were all about. And you can get a more complete picture about the Pharisees from my previous video, Making Sense of the Chosen, number 5. Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, and Zealot. The link is in the discussion box below. Here's a short recap, though. Pharisee is a term that comes from the Hebrew word prushim and seems to mean pure ones or separated ones. They were known for their devotion to the law of Moses and to its exacting application in everyday life. This group of Jews probably formed sometime during or shortly after the 5th century BC, that would be the 400s BC, as a reaction to the Jewish exile in Babylon. They believed that the exile had been caused by Israel's disobedience to God's covenant given through Moses. Okay, so how to prevent that kind of punishment happening again? Their solution was by careful obedience to the covenant. In fact, they described their devotion as building a hedge around the law. What did that mean? Well, it meant that they made additional rules that were even more strict and detailed than God required. The idea was that if people kept these stricter rules that they set for themselves, they would never be in danger of breaking God's covenant again. The Pharisees saw themselves as the guardians of the law, and because of their commitments, they regularly spoke out against any infractions of the covenant that they saw or thought they saw among the people as a whole. For example, healing on the Sabbath. The law of Moses never specifically forbids healing on the Sabbath. It just forbids working on the Sabbath and mandates rest. Okay, but what's work? What's rest? Well, in the centuries before Jesus, the rabbis debated this issue and decided that work is any productive activity. Well, healing is productive. Therefore, they ruled that healing should be forbidden on the Sabbath. And this is why throughout the Chosen episodes, the Pharisees are horrified that Jesus is breaking the Sabbath by doing productive things for people, like healing them, harvesting grain to feed hungry people, and so on. But Jesus took issue with the rabbis' ruling. He taught that the Sabbath is not about ceasing to be productive. It's intended for rest and renewal. In other words, it's intended to bless people. Hence, any activity to promote rest and blessing is in accordance with the spirit of the commandment to rest on the Sabbath. And you can see that with this key difference, Jesus and the Pharisees are on a collision course. Okay, Jesus is bound to have conflict with the Pharisees. But in Jesus' time, the Pharisee sect had two main schools of thought. These viewpoints literally are schools, founded by two revered Jewish rabbis, Hillel and Shammai. The Chosen does a pretty good job of depicting these two Pharisaic schools. Let's take a look at each of these foundational figures. First, Hillel. He was born among the Jews in Babylon, the Jews who had remained in exile rather than returning to the land of Israel. Remember that in the 6th century BC, the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar had exiled the Jews out of their land to Babylon, the modern region of Iraq and Iran. Several generations later, when the Persians conquered the Babylonians, Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. Many made the journey home, but a sizable number of Jews chose to remain in exile in Babylon. And the Jews who remained there were spared the upheavals of the Greek rule over Palestine, and then the Jewish Hasmonean uprising and self-rule, then the Roman conquest, and finally the brutal reign of Herod the Great. Because of the relative peace they experienced in Babylon, these exiled Jews focused on maintaining Jewish culture and learning. Maybe their highest achievement was the compilation of the Babylonian Talmud, a massive collection of debates and decisions by rabbis over various questions related to the law of Moses. So it was into this community that Hillel was born sometime before 100 BC. We know very little about Hillel's early life, but it seems that as a young man he traveled to Jerusalem and Judea and spent years there studying under the respected rabbis of the day. When Herod came to power with the support of Rome, Hillel went back to Babylon, returning some years later as a revered scholar and teacher. By this time he was a man of mature years and he gained followers quickly, and this was partly because of his wisdom and charisma, but it was also partly because he was a descendant of King David on his mother's side, which of course gave him immense credibility among a wide spectrum of Jewish people in that time. Remember, the Jews were looking for the coming of a Messiah who would be a descendant of David. And here was a learned and wise rabbi who might be what they were expecting, at least in terms of his bloodline. Among his many disciples, Hillel became known for his wisdom concerning the spirit of the law of Moses. For example, he's recorded as saying, "If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when?" It was Hillel who advised his fellow Jews not to rebel against the excesses of King Herod. He believed that evil would eventually destroy itself and that God would triumph in the end. So he counseled that people should simply wait for it all to play out. Hillel had a long and incredibly impactful life, more than 100 years. He died around 10 AD when Jesus was a young man. Now Luke chapter 2 records the incident in Jesus' life when he was 12 years old and was accidentally left behind in Jerusalem by his parents. Verses 46 through 47 tell us, "After 3 days they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers." Now it's entirely possible that a very elderly Hillel was among those that Jesus was interacting with. Remember that Jesus was not born in 1 AD. He was probably born in 4 or 5 BC. So Jesus would have been about 14 or 15 years old when Hillel died. So it's entirely possible that Hillel was there on that occasion. Now let's look at Hillel's rival, Shimai. Shimai was born in Judea around 50 BC into a relatively wealthy family. Though Hillel was already middle-aged when Shimai was born, they certainly knew each other. Shimai seems to have been a builder of some sort, possibly owning the first century equivalent of a construction company. He was a dynamic leader and gained followers because of his clear teaching and his reputation for being faithful to the Torah down to the minute details. Now, most of the time, Shimai and Hillel agreed on interpretations of the Torah, which is the law of Moses. But on occasion, they could differ radically. For example, a disciple posed this question to Shimai: if a Jew forgot to say a prayer of thanks after he had finished eating and then left the house where he had eaten, what should he do when he remembered his omission? Shimai required that the man return to the place where he had eaten, no matter what the distance was or the time of day it was, and he should recite the prayer there. Hillel simply ruled that this man should say the prayer wherever he was when he remembered that he'd forgotten. Another example by way of contrast, a Gentile approached Shimai and promised to convert to Judaism if he could be taught the law quickly, literally while standing on one foot. Shimai angrily dismissed him, accusing him of not being serious about learning the law at all. Now the same man then approached Hillel, who said, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow man. That is the whole of the Torah. The rest is commentary. Now go and study." And the man converted. So why does the New Testament depict the Pharisees in such a negative light? Well, most people would at least grant that they were serious about obeying God. But Jesus looked a little deeper. In Matthew 15, Jesus miraculously fed 4,000 people with 7 pieces of bread and only a few fish. He had done many other miracles in the months before that. Then in Matthew 16:6, some Pharisees and Sadducees approached Jesus and commanded a sign from heaven to prove that he was the Messiah. Jesus warned his disciples, "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees." Now, what did he mean by that? Well, I think he was warning that skepticism is very contagious. Not talking about the kind of skepticism that reserves judgment until sufficient evidence allows for belief. That's healthy. Jesus was speaking of the kind of skepticism that no amount of evidence will ever convince. Think about it. Thousands had been fed. Sick and injured people had been healed. People had been delivered from demonic darkness. Yet these Pharisees and their allies were not impressed by any of this. They demanded some kind of personal appearance by God himself. One wonders whether even that would have convinced them. And of course, Jesus refused. He doesn't say this in Matthew 16, but I'm thinking that besides the fact that they dismissed the abundant evidence that they already had available right in front of them, he was outraged at their arrogance in demanding that God perform for them. He pointed out many times that as a whole, the Pharisees were only concerned about rule keeping and pride in being better than everybody else because they kept the rules, and in their self-appointed status as the final judges of who kept the rules well enough to please God. God himself had ceased to be of any kind of real presence or object of love in their lives. After the deaths of Hillel and Shammai, the two rabbinic schools became increasingly divided. Shimai's disciples became even more committed to the strictest interpretations of the law and to keeping their most minute details. Hillel's disciples tended to focus on keeping the spirit of the law and opted for leniency in application when possible. I think it's interesting that today on university campuses you don't run into Shimai clubs, but you do often encounter Jewish student groups calling themselves the Hillel Club. So back to the chosen. The Jewish leaders who eventually had Jesus arrested and crucified were clearly a coalition of Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, and others. But at the end of season 2, the chosen portrays the followers of Shimai as a main party behind the plot to bring Jesus down. So let me be clear. The gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't specify that the school of Shimai was behind the plot. But it is an interesting possibility. It's also intriguing to note that after the resurrection in Acts chapter 5, when the Jewish leaders wanted to crack down on the followers of Jesus like Peter, it was Rabbi Gamaliel, the respected grandson of the great Rabbi Hillel, who counseled discretion towards the apostles when he said, "Leave these men alone. Let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it's from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God." Okay, so much for the lesson in history and culture of first century Judaism. What's this got to do with our own times? In the 21st century, anti-Semitism, which is a hatred of Jews, is a disturbing phenomenon that seems to be growing in certain circles. One of the accusations used by those spreading anti-Semitism in the past was that the Jews were responsible for killing Jesus. That accusation was used at various times in history to attack Jewish communities. And the Nazis used that same accusation, among others, in the 20th century as an excuse for genocide. So I think it's important for us to be very clear that it wasn't the Jews as a whole who rejected and crucified Jesus. It was a certain group among Jewish leadership in the first century working with the Romans who were responsible for all of that. Remember that for several years at least, all of the early followers of Jesus were of Jewish background. And even after that, well into the middle decades of the first century, when large numbers of Gentiles actually began to respond to the gospel, a significant percentage of Christian believers were still of Jewish origin. And of course, most of the Jews of that time knew little or nothing about Jesus one way or the other. It's like this. John 1:4-5 says that Jesus is the source of light, truth, justice, joy, peace, love, all of those good things. John 3:19 tells us that some people hate the light and prefer darkness. So the truth is that among any group of people, Jew or Gentile, black, brown, white, or any shade you care to name, you will find lovers of darkness and lovers of light. Those who love the light will tend to find in Jesus what they have been yearning for. Those who love darkness, whether in destructive lifestyles or in godless self-righteousness, will find in Jesus someone disturbing and something threatening to everything they care about. It's that simple. The Chosen reminds us of this truth. This is Dr. Michael Bogart with Aspect Ministries.